The night was thick with mist, the kind that seemed to absorb sound, leaving the world eerily still. James stood in the middle of the dark alley, his breath coming in heavy, jagged gasps. The stray dog, its fur matted with mud, its ribs jutting out like jagged rocks, lay in his arms, a pitiful bundle of life that clung to him, its eyes, wide and full of pain, locked with his in a moment of pure connection. He'd found it half, dead under the broken streetlight, its whimpers cutting through the silence like a scream. The rain had started to fall just as he picked it up, as though the heavens themselves were mourning with him. "I've got you," he whispered, tears mixing with the rain as they slid down his face. He took the dog to the shelter, did everything he could for it, and in the years that followed, the dog had become more than just a companion. It was family. But that was years ago, and James hadn't thought about that night in a long time. Not until today. Today, when an old man had knocked on his door. "I need to speak to you about your dog," the man said with an air of finality. James froze. The dog that had been his loyal friend for so many years. Was it truly a dog? Or was it something else, something much more complicated than he had ever imagined? The truth, when it came, would shatter everything. James had been sitting in his kitchen, sipping his morning coffee, the world still half asleep around him. The dog, old now, graying at the muzzle, lay curled up by the window, its chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. The warmth of the kitchen, the sunlight filtering through the trees outside, was a small slice of perfection. Then there was a knock at the door. It was sharp, insistent, breaking the stillness. James set his cup down, his feet heavy against the wooden floor as he made his way to the door. He opened it, expecting a neighbor, perhaps a delivery. What he didn't expect was the old man standing in front of him, his weathered face grim, his eyes sharp like steel. "I need to talk to you about your dog," the man said. James' heart skipped. The dog, he hadn't heard anyone refer to it as his dog in years, and the way the man spoke with such certainty unsettled him. The dog, ever aware, perked its ears, its gaze flicking to the man and then back to James. "I've known that animal," the man continued, "and I know what it is." James frowned, confusion knitting his brow. "What do you mean by that?" The man's face softened, but his words hit with the force of a hammer. "It's not a dog, James, it never was." The world seemed to tilt beneath his feet. His mind raced, trying to latch onto something solid, but all that came was the echo of the man's words. The dog, his dog, had always been a creature of quiet loyalty, of love without question. Could it really not be a dog? The days following the stranger's visit passed in a blur. James found himself lost in a sea of research, poring over documents, calling experts, and scouring the internet for answers. Everything he found made the situation clearer, and at the same time, more terrifying. The dog's coat, once thick and beautiful, showed signs of something otherworldly. Its eyes, once so trusting, now seemed far too knowing. Genetic tests revealed anomalies, markers that didn't belong in any breed of dog he knew. In the silence of his home, James confronted his pet, the creature he had saved, the one who had curled up next to him every night. The bond that had felt so pure now felt fragile, as though it might break at any moment. James met with the old man again, this time with more questions but fewer answers. The man had lived with knowledge of the creature's true nature for years, hidden in the shadows, watching as the animal lived a life it was never meant to. "Your dog is part of something older," the man explained, his voice filled with sorrow. "A breed that should have been lost to time. But it was kept alive, manipulated, controlled. It was never meant to live as a pet." James recoiled, the weight of the words suffocating him. The loyalty, the love, it had all been a lie. "What do you want me to do?" James asked, his voice raw. "Let it go," the man said. "It's time." James' world came crashing down as he realized the full scope of what had been kept from him. The creature he had saved was part of a darker, more dangerous world, one that had kept its secrets well hidden. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. There were people who wanted the creature back, people who would stop at nothing to reclaim it. In the end, the decision was clear. The dog needed to return to the wild, to the place it was always meant to be. The day arrived, and James stood at the edge of the forest, the dog by his side. It had grown stronger, its instincts sharper. James knew it was time. He said his final goodbye, his voice barely a whisper. The dog turned, its eyes meeting his one last time, and with that, it disappeared into the trees. James stood there, the weight of the decision settling in his chest. But as he watched the dog vanish into the forest, he felt peace. James couldn't sleep. The moonlight cast long shadows across the room as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind was restless, caught between the weight of the decision he'd made and the silence that had settled in its wake. The house felt empty now, the absence of the dog pressing against his chest like a forgotten sorrow. He had been a man who found comfort in routine, waking to the soft padding of paws on the floor, the quiet breathing of the dog next to him. But now, his world had shifted, the familiar had slipped away. The first light of dawn peeked through the curtains, casting soft golden beams across the room. It was in this quiet moment, as he lay staring at the window, that the memories came flooding back. The day they had met, the storm that had washed them together. It felt like yesterday that he had found the dog, curled up under the streetlight, too weak to move. He remembered how its eyes had locked with his, pleading for help, for kindness in a world that had shown none. He had been young then, unsure of himself, struggling with his own battles. And yet, in that moment, the bond they had shared was real, stronger than any doubts or fears. And now that bond was severed, stretched across the miles between them. James had set the dog free, but the grief he felt was a heavy, lingering weight in his soul. His eyes closed as the memories washed over him. The warmth of the dog's body against his side during cold nights, the sound of its breathing, steady, calm, as they had drifted off to sleep together. The way it had wagged its tail with such unrestrained joy when they had returned from a walk, as if every moment was a gift. But the dog wasn't just a pet, it was a survivor. A creature that had lived in a world of its own, one that James could never fully understand. As much as he wanted to believe in the purity of their connection, he had to face the truth. The dog had its own nature, one that was far beyond the limits of the world they had shared. Still, a part of him felt hollow. He had watched the creature disappear into the forest, watched it slip away from him like a fading memory, and in that moment, he had felt like he was losing a part of himself. But then the question lingered, had he truly lost it? Or had he, in some way, given it the greatest gift? The days that followed were quieter than James had expected. The house, once filled with the soft sounds of the dog's movements, now seemed cold. His heart ached every time he passed the spot where the dog used to lay, where its warm presence had anchored him in the chaos of his own life. The empty space left behind felt like a weight he couldn't escape. But life went on, as it always does. James found himself returning to the routine he had known before the dog. He went to work, met with friends, tried to distract himself, but the emptiness lingered, a quiet companion that refused to leave. One evening, as he walked home from work, something in the air changed. The smell of rain was thick in the air, the sky darkening as clouds gathered above. James felt the familiar tug of the forest, the place where he had let the dog go, and without thinking, he found himself walking toward it. The forest seemed different in the rain, more alive, more ancient. The scent of wet earth filled the air, and the sound of the rain hitting the leaves created a soft, rhythmic beat, almost like the earth itself was breathing. As he ventured deeper, he felt the same sense of calm that had settled over him in the past, the one that came with the dog's presence. He walked for hours, the storm growing heavier, the darkness of the forest surrounding him. He felt like he was searching for something, but he wasn't sure what. The wind picked up, rustling the branches above him. His footsteps were muffled by the thick layer of wet leaves underfoot. The world felt suspended as though time had stopped, leaving him in a quiet void. As he reached the clearing where he had let the dog go, he stopped. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and rain, but there was something else, something familiar. It took him a moment, but when he looked around he saw it. A pair of eyes. They were distant at first, hidden among the shadows of the trees, but James knew immediately what they were. The eyes shone with the same intensity he had seen years ago, the same unwavering trust. The dog. It was standing just beyond the tree line, watching him with those knowing eyes. There was no sound, no movement except for the steady rise and fall of its chest. The dog was no longer the weak, sickly creature he had found that night. It was stronger now, its coat gleaming under the rain, its body poised and alert. James stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He had expected the dog to be gone, to have moved on, but here it was. The bond they had shared was still there, subtle but undeniable, like the thread that connected two hearts across time. For a long while, they simply stood there, locked in an unspoken understanding. Then, without a sound, the dog turned and began to walk back into the depths of the forest. James hesitated for only a moment before following. The dog led James deeper into the forest, as if it was guiding him to some unknown place. The trees grew thicker, their branches tangled overhead, the shadows more pronounced. The rain fell in a steady rhythm, the only sound other than the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. The air was thick with moisture, the scent of damp earth and pine needles filling his lungs. James didn't know where they were going, but he trusted the dog. It was strange, this sense of trust he still felt, even after everything that had happened. The years of companionship, of love and care, had forged something between them, something that even the truth could not break. The further they went, the more the forest seemed to come alive around them. The atmosphere grew charged, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The trees seemed to lean in closer, the wind whispering through the leaves. And then, as if to prove it was all real, the dog stopped. James stepped forward, his heart in his throat. The dog was standing at the edge of a small clearing, the light from the rain filtering through the canopy above. And there, in the center of the clearing, was an ancient stone, a relic, a marker of something forgotten. The dog sat down, its eyes fixed on the stone, and James felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He stepped forward, placing a hand on the stone's cool surface. For the first time in weeks, he felt as though he was where he was meant to be. The dog had led him here, to the heart of the forest, to the place it had always belonged. And in this moment, James understood. He hadn't lost the dog. He had freed it. And in return, the dog had given him the greatest gift of all, a connection to something greater than himself. The dog stayed with James in the clearing for a while, as if waiting for something. The rain began to slow, and the clouds began to break, letting through the first glimmers of sunlight. James stood there, feeling the weight of the past few weeks settle in his chest. He didn't need to say goodbye. The dog had already shown him what needed to be done. It had lived its life, and now it was time for it to move on. With one last look, the dog turned and disappeared into the forest, its silhouette fading into the shadows. James stood there for a moment longer, feeling the quiet of the forest around him, the stillness that had taken root in his heart. As he made his way back, he felt the bond they had shared still alive within him, a silent presence that would always be a part of him. He had given the dog what it needed, just as it had given him what he needed in return, a lesson in love, loss, and freedom. And as he left the forest behind, he knew that sometimes the hardest part of love was letting go, but it was also the most important. Days passed in the silence that only deep grief could bring, but something within James had shifted. The pain of loss was still there, but it was different now. It had settled into a quiet acceptance, like the slow fading of the rain after a storm. The absence of the dog in his life was profound, but it was no longer a wound, more like a scar, a reminder of something that had once been but had to end. James returned to his routine. The house felt hollow, and there were moments when he would catch himself glancing at the spot where the dog used to lay, waiting for the sound of claws clicking on the floor. But those moments grew fewer as time moved on, and he found himself adjusting. He went on walks again, but they were different now. The weight of his previous solitude, once shared with the dog, was now something he carried alone. The forest remained, a quiet sanctuary in the back of his mind, its trees standing tall like guardians over the memories. He visited often, but each time it was with a new understanding. There was peace in the forest, a sort of peace he hadn't expected to find after letting the dog go. The bond between them, it seemed, had transcended the physical. It lived on in the trees, in the rain, in the whispers of the wind that carried through the canopy. There were no answers to the questions he had asked himself about the dog's true nature. But in a way, the answers didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the journey they had shared, the moments that were his alone. He didn't need to know everything. Sometimes, simply knowing what the heart feels is enough. Months passed and life found its rhythm once more. The dog, whatever it truly was gone, but its presence lingered like a quiet echo. James found himself sitting on the porch one evening, the sun low in the sky, painting the clouds in soft hues of pink and gold. He had just returned from a walk in the forest, his thoughts still tangled in the quiet beauty of the woods. A rustle in the bushes pulled him from his thoughts. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw the dog, its figure just beyond the trees, watching him. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the feeling of being observed. It didn't matter. He had learned something important, something that settled in his chest like a truth that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Life was fragile, transient, and at times it asked for things that couldn't be explained. And love, true love, wasn't about ownership. It was about freedom. Freedom to grow, to live, to become what you were meant to be. James smiled to himself, a deep, wistful smile that held no sadness. It was a smile that held the weight of understanding, of quiet peace. He had loved the dog not because it was his, but because it was a creature deserving of love. And in return, the dog had given him something he hadn't even known he needed. The courage to let go, the strength to move forward, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes the most important things in life weren't meant to be held. It was a crisp autumn day when James felt the pull once more. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of damp leaves and earth. The forest called to him, not with urgency, but with an invitation, a beckoning that stirred something deep within his soul. He had been visiting less frequently, but today the forest felt different. It was time to return. As he walked deeper into the woods, the familiar sounds of nature filled his ears, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, the soft creaking of branches in the wind. The trees towered above him, their branches reaching for the sky as though they were waiting for him. The path was damp, the ground soft beneath his boots, but it felt right. Each step brought him closer to something he couldn't quite name, but that he knew he needed to find. And then, as if by some unseen force, he arrived at the clearing, the place where it had all changed. The stone was still there, weathered by time and the elements, but it didn't seem as ancient as it once had. It felt familiar now, home, almost. James sat beside it, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes closed for a moment, simply feeling the connection. When he opened his eyes, the dog was there again. Not in the form he remembered, but somehow still present. It was as if the forest had wrapped its arms around the creature and held it in a timeless embrace. The dog stood just beyond the trees, its form a silhouette against the soft light filtering through the canopy. James didn't move. He didn't need to. The dog took one last look at him, its eyes bright with something James could only describe as recognition. And then, just like before, it turned and walked back into the depths of the forest, disappearing as though it had never been there. James stayed for a while, long after the dog had gone. The forest whispered its secrets to him, but this time he didn't need answers. The connection had been made. And though it wasn't meant to last forever, it had been enough. James returned to his home that evening, the weight in his chest lighter than it had been in years. The bond he had shared with the dog, whatever it truly was, had come full circle. He didn't need to understand every mystery, every question. Some things were beyond human comprehension, and that was okay. What mattered was the journey, the love, the letting go. The world was full of mysteries, but not every answer needed to be found. And sometimes, the most profound connections were the ones that lived in silence, in the spaces between words, in the quiet moments that only the heart could understand. As James sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he realized that the dog, no matter what it had been, had given him something far greater than he could ever repay. It had shown him that love isn't about ownership or possession. It's about letting go, about giving others the freedom to become who they truly are. And in the end, it was that understanding that brought him peace. The forest, the dog, and the quiet spaces in between. They were all a part of him now. And he would carry them with him, always. Winter had come quietly to the town, wrapping everything in a blanket of snow. The once familiar trees of the forest stood bare, their skeletal limbs reaching toward the heavens as if to remind the world of their resilience. James had spent much of the past few weeks in solitude, reflecting on everything that had unfolded. The days had blurred together, and the cold seemed to settle into his bones. Yet there was a strange warmth that filled him every time he thought of the forest, of the dog, and the peace that had come from letting go. One evening, as he walked through the quiet streets, the air biting at his cheeks, he saw something out of the corner of his eye. It was just a flash, like a shadow moving too quickly, but it was enough to make his heart skip a beat. For a second, he thought he saw the dog again, its shape, its movement so familiar, so comforting. But when he turned, the street was empty, save for the quiet snow falling softly from the sky. The dog was gone, or was it? He couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, somewhere, it was still out there, watching him, protecting him. He didn't know if it was the lingering effects of their shared bond or if his mind was simply playing tricks on him. But in that moment, he realized it didn't matter. Whether it was a shadow in the night or an unexplainable feeling in his heart, the dog's presence had been real and still was. That night, James returned home with a new sense of understanding. The dog had given him something priceless, an experience that transcended the ordinary, that pushed him to grow in ways he never expected. And though their time together had been short, it had been profound, marked by moments of deep connection, and ultimately, the lesson that sometimes, to love fully, one must release the hold on what they cherish most. Spring arrived in time, the snow melting away to reveal patches of green grass, fresh buds on trees, and the promise of new beginnings. James found himself walking more often, taking longer journeys into the forest, seeking the peace he had once shared with the dog. He no longer felt the need to search for the animal. It had already taught him what he needed to know. But there was something about the forest that called him back, something about the quiet rhythm of the earth that seemed to answer questions without words. One afternoon, as he made his way down the familiar path to the clearing where they had first met, James was struck by the quiet beauty around him. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, the distant call of birds filling the otherwise peaceful silence. He paused for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of the past few months slip away. As he reached the clearing, he saw something unexpected, a small, sprouting tree in the place where he had let the dog go. It was young, fragile, but it stood tall, reaching for the sunlight as though it had been planted there to mark the moment. James knelt down to touch it, his fingers brushing the soft leaves. The tree had grown in the same space where the dog had once stood, where their paths had crossed in a way that had changed them both. It felt symbolic, like life continuing, evolving despite the pain of loss. The tree was proof that even in letting go, something new could grow. The dog's legacy, in a way, had become a part of the forest, a living, breathing reminder of the bond they had shared. James smiled softly, his heart swelling with a sense of peace. In the stillness of the forest, as the wind whispered through the branches, he realized that life was a series of moments, some fleeting, some everlasting. The dog had been one of those moments. And now, it was time for him to embrace whatever came next. James spent the rest of the day in the forest, the air growing warmer as the sun began to dip low in the sky. He wandered aimlessly at first, allowing the path to guide him, until he found himself standing at the edge of the clearing once more. It was here, in this quiet, sacred place, that he had released the dog into the wild. He had thought he was saying goodbye, but in truth, he had only been letting it go, freeing it to be something greater than himself. As he stood there now, surrounded by the tall trees and the soft hum of nature, he knew that their connection was far from over. The dog had given him a lesson in love and loss, in freedom and letting go, and now he was free too. As the last light of day faded into night, James took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. He closed his eyes and let the stillness wash over him, letting go of everything that had once been a burden. The dog was a memory, yes, but it was also a living, breathing part of who he had become. And in that, he had found peace. In the months that followed, James never saw the dog again. But he never stopped thinking about it either. The bond they had shared had shifted, evolved, and he no longer felt sadness when he thought of it. Instead, he felt gratitude for the lessons the dog had taught him, for the courage to face the unknown, and for the strength to let go. He often walked in the forest, returning to the clearing where they had first met. The tree that had sprouted from that moment of release had grown taller, its leaves reaching for the sky. It was a small thing, but it was a symbol of the journey, of the growth that had come from letting go. And as he stood there, looking up at the tree, James realized that he had not just let go of the dog, he had let go of fear. Fear of loss, fear of the unknown, fear of never being enough. The dog had taught him that love wasn't about holding on. It was about trust. Trust in the journey, trust in the unknown, and trust in what was meant to be. The dog had been a part of his story, and he would always carry it with him, even if it was just in the memories, the lessons, and the quiet peace he had found in the letting go. And so, James continued on his journey, a little wiser, a little more at peace, and a little more open to whatever the world had yet to offer. The legacy of the dog was alive in him, and it always would be, because sometimes the greatest gift of all is knowing when to let go. And as the winds rustled through the trees, James smiled softly to himself. He was free and the world was wide open, waiting for him to take the next step. It had been a year since the last time James had seen the dog, and although he'd never stopped visiting the forest, something had changed within him. Life had moved forward. The pain of loss had transformed into something softer, more manageable. It wasn't gone. No, it never truly would be. But it was now a part of the landscape of his life, like the forest itself. The trees, the wind, the rain, it was all interconnected, woven together in a way that brought him comfort. The dog, or whatever it had been, was now just a memory, a chapter of his life that he had come to terms with. Yet every time he walked through the forest, he felt a tug at his heart. It was subtle, almost like a whisper carried by the breeze, just beyond his understanding, but it was always there. One particularly cold morning, as he made his way through the still, foggy forest, something unexpected happened. The sky was overcast, heavy with the promise of more rain, and the dampness in the air clung to his skin like an old friend. He had been walking for nearly an hour, his thoughts drifting, when something stirred in the underbrush. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. His mind, for a brief moment, told him it couldn't be, but his heart remembered. There, barely visible through the thick fog, was a shape. A shadow moved between the trees, its form too large, too familiar to be anything else. His pulse quickened, and for the first time in a long while, the ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as if the past was reaching up to pull him back. He took a step forward, unsure of what he was about to witness. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to run, to turn away, but the pull of the unknown was stronger than his fear. And then, through the haze, he saw it. A pair of eyes gleaming, watching him from a distance. It wasn't the dog, not exactly. But it was the same gaze, the same knowing eyes that had once fixed on him in the alley, pleading for help, the same eyes that had been there in moments of quiet understanding. Only now there was something different. A quiet energy, fierce, powerful, and alive. James stood still, unsure of what to do. He felt as though the universe had conspired to bring him here, to this exact moment. And yet, he couldn't explain why. Was this some trick of the mind? Or was the dog his dog, truly still out there, watching him in ways that defied logic? The creature took a step closer, and James' heart skipped a beat. His mind told him to run, but his feet refused to obey. The bond, however strange, however undefined, was still there. The creature's movements were fluid, almost supernatural, but there was a tenderness to the way it moved. James took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs, steadying him. He had learned much since the day he had let the dog go. He had learned about love, about loss, about freedom. But now, standing face to face with this presence, he realized there was still much he didn't understand. He knelt down, slowly, cautiously, and extended a hand toward the creature. He had no words, no promises to make. But he didn't need them. The creature, this being, had been with him for longer than he could fathom, and they shared something that transcended the need for explanation. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The forest was silent except for the rustling of leaves, the wind stirring the branches. The creature's eyes never left his, and James could feel a deep, silent connection between them. It wasn't the same as it had been before. It wasn't the same bond of ownership or companionship. This was different. This was the understanding that sometimes love didn't need to be spoken. It simply existed. As James walked deeper into the forest, each step felt lighter than the last. The weight of the past, the questions, the uncertainty, all of it had faded, leaving only the quiet sound of his breath, the rustle of the leaves beneath his feet, and the song of the wind in the trees. The journey had been long, and at times difficult, but with each passing moment, James felt himself drawing closer to something he hadn't expected to find: peace. The forest, once a place of confusion and grief, had become a sanctuary, not because it held the answers to every question, but because it held him. It held his story, his love, his loss, and the quiet understanding that sometimes there are no perfect endings, only moments that are enough. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the trees, James stopped. He had reached a clearing, a familiar one, but this time it felt different. The air was still, the ground soft beneath his feet. The space was empty, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt full, full of everything that had come before and everything that was yet to come. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the air, letting the peace of the forest settle around him. It was as if everything had led him here, to this moment of quiet understanding. The dog, the creature, whatever it had been, was no longer a part of his life in the way it once was, but it had left an imprint on his soul that could never be erased. And in that, James found a sense of completeness. Opening his eyes, he glanced one last time at the world around him. The trees stood tall, the light of the setting sun shimmering through the branches. The wind whispered in the distance, carrying the scent of earth and pine. And as James stood there, at the edge of the clearing, he realized that his journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. With a final contented breath, James turned and began to walk away. The forest behind him and the world ahead. His heart was light, his mind clear. He had learned the most important lesson of all sometimes. The greatest gift you can give is freedom. Not just to others, but to yourself. And as he stepped into the fading light, he felt the soft presence of the dog. The creature, still with him, watching over him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. But he didn't need to understand. He only needed to feel. The forest had taught him that. And in that moment, James understood love, in all its forms, was the journey. And he was finally free to walk it.